In the short intro, we have been discussing the function of several pieces, their strengths, their shortcomings, but I would like to zoom in now on the role of pawns in chess. And one of the most important functions of a pawn is to protect the king. After the opening, when the king has been brought into safety, the king castled, the king normally can count on the support of its own pawns. So these pawns in front of the king, they are a shelter, offering a shelter for the king, so that the pieces could be any piece. They are not able to attack the king immediately. Of course, they are able to attack the pawns, but it's not like the king is immediately under check and you are getting mated immediately. So the role of pawns, one of the roles is to protect the king, and there are different pawn formations in front of the king possible. For instance, now with 3 pawns in front of the king, when they haven't moved yet, the king is, generally speaking, very well safe. It cannot easily become under an attack because black will have to make sacrifices in order to open up the position in front of the king. The only thing you have to think about with such pawn formation, with 3 pawns next to each other, is back rank motive. So imagine black has a rook or a queen. You always got to reckon with, for example, a rook coming to the back rank, which would lead to checkmate. Could be a queen, could be anything else. So, as I mentioned, there are different pawn formations possible to protect the king. Now, if we look at the black king, we see that black has almost the same thing, but there is this pawn on a6, which is the difference if you mirror it to white's position. That means that back rank motives, they are not possible now, because king can always try to escape to a7. And, well, that leads also to different dynamics. It means that white can try to find a piece to, for instance, the bishop, to cover this square, so back rank ideas will be renewed. So what I want to show you with this example is that these little pawn moves, they can have a big impact also on other pieces. For instance, white cannot put a knight on b5 because that will be covered by a pawn. Well, that's shortly what the pawns are doing to protect the king. There are also other pawn functions. Let's have a look. In the following position, I've added some more pieces to the position. So what is very important, one other very important role of a pawn is to protect pieces. Very simple, very simple. Look, for instance, black has a nice bishop on c6, attacking the knight on f3. Black could consider taking it, but at the moment, it's still defended by the pawn. So, of course, white is able to recapture if the knight will be taken. So the task of the pawn is to keep the knight protected. If you would move that pawn forward, that knight would be unprotected. So you shouldn't do that. But also other interesting fragments of this position show you that pawns are very important. For instance, the bishop on b2 attacks the knight on f6, which on his turn is defended by the pawn on g7. So, of course, that pawn from g7 cannot move yet because the knight would be unprotected. If we look at this bishop on c6, it's under threat by the white rook, but it's also protected by the pawn on d7. So white will not consider taking on c6 because that would lose material. The rook is more worth than the bishop. So here we see that the pawns are directly protecting pieces. Pawns can also indirectly protect pieces. For instance, if we look to the b file, this rook on b8 is on a half-open file. We will discuss more about open and half-open files later on. The reason why it's not open and half-open is because there is a pawn on b3. But that pawn on b3 is actually very important because it does protect the bishop on b2. If that pawn on b3 would not have been there, black could have taken the bishop on b2. So we see that the pawn on b3 closes the b file, and is also helpful protecting the bishop which is behind it. So pawns can protect the king, can also protect each other. Look, for instance, the pawn on g2 protects the pawn on h3, even though it's not under attack. And the same, of course, can be said for the pawn on a2, which is protecting the pawn on b3. So there's a lot of interaction between these pieces, and that's something very important to be aware of. You cannot only think about one specific part of the board. It's about the total picture, which is what matters. Hope that made it a bit more clear, and well, I also hope you enjoy this beautiful painting, if I say it myself. Let's go to the next function for a pawn, and that is shown in the following position. So just a random position, but what I want to show you, if you look at this position, what probably what one of the first things you see, you do the material count, you will see eventually that it's material even. Both sides have their own chances, of course, but I want to zoom in on white's pawn formation. Let's have a look. These pawns, they are very nicely connected in one chain. That's a pawn formation. Pawns are nicely connected. It's a very nice pawn structure for white. And as you can see, the pawns are protecting each other. Pawn on g2 protects pawn on f3. Pawn on f3 protects the pawn on e4. But also the pawn on b2 protects pawn on c3, and c3 defends d4. So the pawns are fulfilling the task we have discussed in the previous clip, in the previous fragment, sorry. What the task of these pawns are, normally you would like to bring up the pawns, like you can try to bring it up, push the pawn, and try to create a passed pawn. But you know, the more you advance the pawn, the more it comes into the opponent's camp, and there's a chance it can just be taken and you can lose the pawn eventually. But here in this particular case, the pawns are not really intending to come forward, but their aim is mainly to restrict the mobility of black's minor pieces, of the bishops and the knight. So this bishop on g6 cannot really do anything. It doesn't exert pressure on the pawn on e4. It's too well protected by the pawn, but also by the other pieces. It could go to h5, but if it goes to h5, it doesn't threaten to take the pawn, because that pawn on f3 is well defended by the pawn on g2, as I mentioned. So this bishop on g6 has been very nicely restricted by white's pawns. And the same can actually be said for the bishop on b6. That bishop is basically stuck on b6. Doesn't exert pressure. The pawn is defended by the pawn on c3, and well, also the knight on f6 cannot come really forward, cannot jump into white's position. All these squares are nicely taken away by the pawns. So that's also something very important to be aware of. Pawns are protecting each other, protecting the king, but they also have the task of trying to reduce the activity of the opponent's pieces. And well, basically I have been talking now about black's minor pieces, but if we look also at the major pieces, there are hardly any open files. In fact, there are no open files in this case. There's only one half open d file for the rook, for black rook. But even if black would consider to put a rook there, it cannot do much, because the pawn on d4 is so well protected. The pawn cannot be taken. The only thing black could consider at some point is trying to challenge the pawns with its own pawns in order to open the files, in order to maximize its own activity. So 3 roles of pawns: protecting king, protecting pieces, and restricting the mobility of the opponent's pieces. And okay, if you do get a chance, you can use the pawn also as an attacking weapon, trying to bring it up the board to create a passed pawn. But for me, these 3 main functions are now very well explained. Hope it's clear. And then let's see what other roles pawn can fulfill.